Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining FlexTech Alliance's webinar. Today, Lawrence Gasman of NanoMarkets will deliver insights from their recent research into smart windows and how the market is developing for this application for transparent conductors. This is Heidi Hoffman, Managing Director of FlexTech Alliance, and I will be your moderator today. A few logistical items before we start. All participants are placed on mute during the webinar. To submit a comment or a question, please submit it in the question box in the control panel on your screen. We'll try to get to as many of these as we can in the time that we have. If we don't get to your question, please email us after the webinar. I'll give the email address a little later on. You can submit questions anonymously, or if you sign them, I will announce your name along with the question. The slides and recording from today's presentation will be available in a few days on our website. And we'll send an email with that location and a link when they're up and ready to be viewed. So before we start, I wanted to let you all know that FlexTech is sponsoring a workshop in 2 weeks on the bigger transparent conductor market, including a deeper dive into the technology and the supply chain. The workshop is held at Semicon West in San Francisco on July 10th. For more information, visit our homepage at www.flextech.org. When you are there, you will see this ad and have direct links to the agenda and the registration information. On the right-hand side, you see that we're also sponsoring a tech spot on the show floor at Semicon West in Moscone Center the following day, July 11th, on integrating conventional silicon with flexible electronics. So many refer to this as the hybrid approach to flexible and rigid electronics, getting those working together. This seminar is free to anyone attending the show, and again, the full lineup of speakers can be accessed from www.flextech.org. We'll also have FlexTech will also have a booth at Semicon West, and please feel free to drop by and say hello. So as many of you know, FlexTech's mission breaks down into 3 parts. We evangelize for the flexible and printed electronics sector and the supply chain. These are our primary member companies. We champion funding for next generation R&D, and when that funding comes our way, we seek out the best proposals for advancing the technology and helping to fund that development. And thirdly, we provide connections and education for the industry. And it's under the education part of our mission that we bring you this webinar. Smart Windows is a promising application with direct impact on the developers and suppliers of electronic materials. We're pleased to work with NanoMarkets to bring additional insights to this market space. NanoMarkets has been tracking the Smart Windows market for 4 years and has just published an updated report on the market and technology. Lawrence will take us through a few of the key findings of the technologies involved and the uncertainties associated with deploying Smart Windows. So our presenter today is Lawrence Gasman, a principal analyst and co-founder of NanoMarkets. He's an expert on new materials markets, primarily on the economics of those markets. He's consulted, published, and spoken extensively on these topics for both the private and the financial sectors, and brings market insights into other advancing technologies. For without a market pull, everyone will, I'm sure, agree, the technology push rarely succeeds. With that, Lawrence, I'll turn it over to you to tell us how, when, and where we will see Smart Windows entering our world.
Slide. So thank you very much, Heidi, for that introduction. A little bit about my company. Heidi said in quite a lot already. NanoMarkets provides information and industry analysis on advanced materials markets and related markets. We've been doing that for about 10 years now, which seems incredible in itself. We provide forecasts on all major thin film and printed markets, which is how we've got to know FlexTech so well. We're based in the US, but we have extensive contacts all over the world, or more honestly in Asia and Europe, not in Africa so far. And what you're going to hear today is largely based on a report that we published called Worldwide Smart Windows Markets 2013 to 2020. We've been covering smart windows now for I think about 4 years, and this is the latest iteration of our report. I guess a good place to begin is at the beginning, and ask the question, what's smart windows? The term smart these days is very much an in term. We have smart windows, smart networks, smart cars, smart food, and probably a million other smart things. I want to make clear at the beginning that what I'm really talking about here is self-dimming windows. That's usually what people mean about smart windows, but there's plenty of other meanings, and not that I'm running a class here in technical semantics, but I think it's interesting to see what else has been from time to time lumped under the smart windows name, because it also is a sign of where I think the technology will eventually go. Self-dimming windows is certainly the highest, well actually apart from one, low-E glass is the highest revenue generating of all these things you'll see on your screen. And eventually I see these all merging together in some kind of very, very smart window, but not for quite a while yet. So I'm just going to quickly talk about these. Self-cleaning windows exist. They're a real market. You see them mostly in residential windows, mainly because the actual performance of these windows is not that good. It's good enough for residential applications, but for where self-cleaning may be very critical, not so much. For instance, there are a couple of companies promising front screen windows for windshield applications in transportation where you won't need a window wiper, and that's going to be quite a while before that happens. Self-repairing windows are fascinating because they use some interesting nanomaterials, but they're not real yet. BIPV glass is not often thought about in smart windows, but certainly adds value-added functionality to windows, and that's real and quite important in a number of ways. OLED glass, where you perhaps use a glass panel as a window during the day and then it lights up in, well, I guess internally or externally during the day, is still, I mean, it doesn't exist at all. Combining a transparent display with a window so that you can, so it will give information when you need that or when the owner needs it, or acts as a window is real, and they're putting transparent displays into mirrors now. As an aside, when I was in O'Hare Airport in Chicago earlier this year, I went into the men's restroom and they advertise to you while you're shaving or whatever, which is a little distracting. I put low-E glass in there partly because it's included in our report for comparison purposes, but in a way that's the biggest form of smart windows, not self-dimming as such, but highly insulating. And that's the one area that's just huge. It's tens of billions of dollars, but not much of an opportunity because the people in there are already, it's already mature technology with companies who are really fixed into that marketplace. So just, and now we're, forget all that. That shows you where we're headed. I won't mention it again. Let's look at the smart windows markets as I've defined it. This is the numbers we came to for the whole marketplace. And the takeaways from that, you can read the numbers for yourself, presumably. The takeaways from that are that it's already a fairly mature market in the sense that anything that's $2.3 billion is not something that's new. And that's partly because these technologies have been around. They're usually mature in the sense of being around for a long time, but not mature in the sense of still needing considerable technological improvements. We're predicting that about 3 years from now, the market will have shot up roughly 50%, and then by 2020, a bit more than double, which is good growth, but not dramatic growth compared with perhaps some of the other technologies that, for instance, FlexTech and, for that matter, NanoMarkets deals with. Again, fairly mature technology. When you look at that number compared with, say, the 80 billion or so that goes into low-E glass, you realize that maybe it's not a niche market, but it's certainly a sector of the glass market that's rather specialized. I should mention that in the main report that we're selling, of course, we break out a lot of things. The residential is broken out by many different technologies, commercial and transport too, and I think there's something like 50 forecast tables in the actual report. You will not be seeing all of those, and for the most part, I'm going to focus on some of the stuff going on in the residential market, although it is more or less the same technology trends that you will see going on in all the other markets. Now, the central issue here is what's causing all of this. I think that the number one issue really here is the rising real energy prices. And let's be clear what I mean by that. If you go to the gas pump, prices of gas, if you put any other form of energy material, change rapidly. Now, sometimes that's just because of seasonal effects. Sometimes, and this is not often as widely credited as it should be, it's simply because of how the dollar is going for imported energy products. So if the dollar starts to drop, oil prices go up, but it's not really because of real demand, it's just because of monetary effects. What I'm talking about is that the population of the world is going up and people on the whole in the world are getting richer, using more energy, so more competition for what there is. So real energy prices go up, and that's what's going to affect the market here. People have put self-dimming materials in for lots of reasons, but as we're going to see, as real energy prices continue to rise, there's just more reason to put in energy-saving devices. And see this across a very wide spectrum of markets that we cover, but it's certainly the factor affecting, it's why everybody's so excited about smart glass these days, even if they don't know that's why they're so excited about it. The other thing I think is there's a push from the supply side. Glass is pretty much a commodity, and there's now pressure on all the glass companies to look around for value-added applications, and you'll get, there's obviously a line between the companies who focus on electronic glass, essentially on display glass, and they're looking at all sorts of cool stuff like transparent displays, but then there's the people who focus on window glass, and I'm not going to mention specific companies, it should be fairly clear who I'm talking about, and they're looking for the same reasons for value-added opportunities. In a way, they've moved down that road before when they've looked at IGUs and low-E glass, but that revolution has already happened. As they see the demand for smart windows begin to take off, they're beginning to find that this is perhaps the new value-added opportunity. The other reason that people are paying attention to this now is a belief that we're through the worst of the world financial crisis, which has two impacts. One is that real estate markets begin to recover, and, surprise, surprise, window markets are very dependent on real estate markets, and also since about half of the market, actually more, goes into transportation. I should mention, actually going back to one of the first slides, that transportation and the way we've defined it is broken out into in the report into automotive, meaning cars and trucks, aircraft, and public transportation. But to all intents and purposes, the entire market is dominated by automotive needs, automotive consumption of glass. And they're the three factors that really stand out. I'm going to talk about the other three in a little bit more detail because they're more subtle and deserve a slide of their own. One is that while everybody's getting excited about smart glass right now, there's actually a certain amount of disconnect between what the vendors of smart glass are saying and what the potential buyers of smart glass are saying, or actually the specifiers, who are the architects and construction companies, building engineers. When we did a fair number of interviews for our study, and when we, over the years, we've been doing this for a few years, we've talked to a lot of people. When you talk to some of the architects and builders, you get a different story than when you talk to the vendors of the smart windows themselves. I'll be coming back to that. Regulatory factors I'll be coming back to, and comfort factors, which is an area that we tend to forget. Maybe we're too utilitarian these days. And this is really a market story. There's some technology there that deserves attention, but we have yet to see a big technology story in the past year. Certainly when we looked at last year's Smart Windows report that we did, we didn't see any great leaps forward. I'll be talking a little bit more about the great leaps forward that might be possible in the future, but they're not that great a leap forward. In transportation, the factors are all more or less the same, but there's some variation on the theme. When you're using smart glass in air conditioning, when using smart glass in transportation, what you're really trying to do there is really relates to air conditioning. The cabins of autos and trucks, and for that matter, aircraft, tend to heat up if there's a lot of glass in it. So having a self-tinting glass or some kind of self-dimming glass of some kind makes a lot of sense. Privacy is a factor in transportation in a somewhat different way than it is in a building. You might, obviously classically, if you're in a limousine, you might want to have privacy from the driver, but you might also want to have privacy from people outside. The cool factor is it's a demographic issue there. Young people like cool perhaps more than older people, but having a tinted glass window on your car can be a selling feature. But again, nothing very new there. And I'll be coming back to what really is new in a little while. One thing I want to stress, almost as a footnote, but it's important, is that the aerospace industry acts in a rather peculiar way within smart windows. It is a very good PR to get your product into a major airliner that's about to be built, and several companies several Windows companies have really focused, some glass companies have really focused on telling the story about getting their smart Windows product into the Boeing Dreamliner, but the actual revenues from that are pretty tiny. We played around with our forecasting model, and it is just very hard to come up with numbers that are very impressive in terms of revenue potential. And even if we're wildly wrong, let's suppose we're out by a factor of 10, it still doesn't change that judgment. However, aerospace may well be where leading edge technologies are tried out because the actual demands can be quite great on an airline or other aircraft, and also because within the airline industry at least, they're always looking for novel things to impress their customers. So let's just go back to the issue I mentioned about specifier skepticism. This really came out, I mean, there's always a distinction in any market studies, such as the ones we do, between talking to the vendors and talking to the end users, because the vendors always tell us that their technologies are the greatest things in sliced bread, but the users, in this case we're talking about architects and construction companies and engineers, are always very skeptical. And we heard from quite a few people we interviewed, oh, the costs are too high, or the performance is not good enough. And of course, it's possible to take that literally, and basically then our report would have been to say that the people in this business who are producing the smart glass don't really know what they're talking about, and they're all doomed to fail. It's a little bit more complex than that. I think, firstly because the market is in existence already, which leads to some skepticism about the skepticism, but also when you look at the underlying economics, yes, the cost of smart windows are definitely higher than non-smart windows, but when you take first of all, the price premium isn't that high, and secondly, when you take into consideration, and this is particularly true in commercial buildings, the fact that it means that you won't be using blinds or curtains. You know, the extra cost isn't that high. Performance not good enough is actually true, but again, it's not that bad, and yet again, it's quite common to have smart windows now on cars and residential buildings, and has been for some time. I think the rest of this, and really the message here for companies who are vendors in the smart field, from what we're seeing, is that there are, you know, on one hand, there's opportunities for pioneering architects and construction firms to make a thing out of smart windows, whether that making a thing is directed towards the ultimate customers for the buildings, you know, come buy our building because it has smart windows. We've seen that work before. Come buy our buildings because it has fiber to the home, for instance, or whether they're making it to, you know, to the company, you know, like construction firms who are going to develop an entire neighborhood. But anyway, the consciousness raising in this field is a very important thing, and that's pretty much the message from those bottom two bullet points. So to summarize, you've got a user community that's still fairly skeptical, a few pioneers, and a need for those pioneers to get out and do their job of consciousness raising. We're fairly bullish about this market because we've seen other technology markets before, which are just on their verge of really taking off, still had a very skeptical potential audience who actually didn't know that much about the technology. Let's look at regulatory factors. First of all, there are few, if any, regulations anywhere in the world that say, you know, if well, either you must use smart windows of some kind, or that we'll give you a tax break if you use smart windows. What there is both carrot and the stick regulations, and the report, by the way, goes into a lot of detail about regulations around the world that are highly relevant to all of this. But what there are, I think, are probably about three. I'm sure these break up into different areas too, that are very influential in driving the need for smart windows, and will increase, I think, in their importance. One of them is the LEED and zero energy trends, which really come down to trying to control thermal effects and lighting effects, and you can do that any way you like. I mean, if you're trying to get to a zero energy, you want to stop the building from heating up. It's a sunny day. You want to use as little energy to light up the building as possible. So you want big windows, essentially. I don't think anybody really specifically talks in the codes about smart windows, as I've already mentioned, but smart windows seem to be almost exquisitely designed to fit in with that general design connotation that is zero energy. Consumer labeling I mentioned in passing because it came up in some of our interviews. What that does really is make the performance of Windows better understood. You know, nobody necessarily intuitively immediately thinks what a smart window could do for them, but if that's somehow built into the labeling, you know, something about transmittance or thermals or something, then maybe that help drives the smart windows market. And then, of course, financial incentives, including tax incentives. It's quite common across the world to have tax incentives and financial incentives provided by mostly local governments to ensure that the insulation of your window is is appropriate, and it's easy to see how that could shift to transmittance of light, given the functional relationship between that and other policy objectives. I'm leaving comfort factors to the last because they don't tend to get emphasized all that much. If you go to the websites and some of the vendors of smart glass, you don't see all that much of it, and I think that's a shame because it's definitely a selling feature. One thing is a window is a close economic substitute for lighting, and we know increasingly that natural light is the best light you can have. As an aside, NanoMarkets did a report on smart lighting recently, and which I happen to have written. As part of that process, I had to read some of the literature, the recent literature on how natural light affects people in terms of their work performance, in terms of their health, and it really is quite dramatic how good natural light is compared with artificial light. So windows are good because they let in natural light, but you don't want them to let in too much natural light. So what you really need is smart windows. So that's what the advertising should say. Also, the self-dimming functionality means that you let in as much light during winter as possible, and you are able to keep out the sunlight when it's blinding everybody at work. And in fact, with at least some of the technologies that are now going, you can do that a much better job than you could with blinds. Privacy is also an issue. I mean, in cars, it's particularly an issue. It might be an issue in some kinds of industrial or commercial applications. There's some, trying to remember what they are, but in the report we've got some examples of really cool smart windows that are in movies that provide for applications where people can go into a meeting and then they're in a nice big glass room and then it all suddenly goes opaque on them. That's mostly fantasy, but it's in the way I see it. The movie is really fantasy, but you can also imagine that being an actual useful application. The final thing I should mention is more glass means smart glass. If we're going to have bigger windows and all of those issues I talked about, the thermals and the natural light and all of these things become more of an issue. If you're in an old-fashioned building in the south of the United States, or I was in India recently, you see buildings that were built with very little glass because they were built before electricity was widely available. So you want to cut down on windows, but the more glass you have there, the more control you want over what that glass actually does. So I think comfort factors are actually pretty important, just to get the emphasis. So I think they will, but it's important not to miss them out. And I suppose that's a good segue into how we think the market's going to do at an international level. In misquote, badly misquote Tip O'Neill, all smart Windows markets are local, and that's partly because of weather. The needs for Windows in Iceland are going to be rather different than needs for the Windows in Zimbabwe. But what we're seeing is, and this is just a summary of what's in the report, in the US there is definitely and US we think is the biggest market for this for a number of reasons. And again, in the report we've shown the factors we've taken into consideration. The housing market appears to be growing again, which is very good news for building products of all kinds, and ultimately that's what smart windows are. But it may just be a monetary effect, we may just be in a bubble, and I tend to think we are, but that's a conversation for a different time. But we think by 2016, the smart windows market in the US will be about 1.1 billion. So a pretty substantial market for smart windows by market share. In Europe, we're seeing a different thing. The countries in Southern Europe in particular are in not good shape. Germany is sort of the one exception that's showing some growth at least. Also, there are claims by people who know a great deal more about real estate than I do that there are good real estate prospects in Germany, that basically property there is undervalued. Whether that turns out to be the case remains the case. But the market for Europe isn't that much smaller than the US. And there is this focus on sustainable building products and sustainable construction that will certainly buoy the smart windows market. China is the most interesting market of all, and and I would love to talk about that more than I'm about to say, but one of the factors there is that for some of the interesting buildings, or larger buildings that might actually use smart windows, the architects and not construction companies, but often the architects and building engineers often come from the West or sometimes from Japan, and so are more aware than they might otherwise be compared with the Chinese firm about smart windows. So there's maybe a supply push there. And there's also going to be, I think, and this is our prediction, domestic smart windows firms opening up in China if there aren't already, and that's in line with novel technology firms emerging in China, which is now happening very fast in general. It's hard to believe that smart windows firms won't be among that trend. The problem is that China has a very distorted construction market, partly because they barely rely on markets to create buildings that there are other policy objectives that are followed. So there's whole areas where buildings are being built and they're impressive and don't usually use smart windows at this point, but where there's no more need of buildings because they're largely unoccupied. But there's a few areas where there's actually a shortage of buildings too. So, there ended my lecture on the Chinese real estate market. We think it's a fairly substantial market for smart windows by about 2016. Japan's also interesting. Consumers are fond of new technology there, so smart windows are the kind of thing that they might buy. And there may be an undervalued real estate market there too. There's certainly people who follow real estate who are claiming that about the housing market. But at the same time, they've got a deflating economy for really big reasons like falling population. So maybe the real estate market isn't so undervalued, and I don't have a number specifically for Japan. We have other areas that we cover in the report, but those are the big ones. Let's begin. I'm not going to talk that much about the technologies in depth as technologists, but what I really want to lead you through is the idea that we're moving from a passive technology scenario to an active scenario. So passive is just film that dims things and maybe responds directly to sunlight. It gets darker as the sun goes on it. So that's passive, and it's a smart materials kind of play. And then active smart windows are those that certainly might involve smart windows, smart materials, but have some kind of electronic control in there. And although there are of many different kinds, the active product, understandably, if you're adding a subsystem based on electronics, allows a much greater level of control. The passive smart windows technologies are also not technologies that are full of opportunity. Basically, what we're talking about them is Windows films, which are fairly conventional technologies that have been around a long time. They have never been broadly accepted as a good technology. They don't perform that well. They're attractive in some ways. It's a mature product, but it's always been a little bit of a niche product. Unfortunately, most of the technologies that have appeared to challenge, passive technologies that appear to challenge basic architectural window films haven't really got much going for them anyway. Certainly the supply structure is very limited. There's only a few suppliers. In case of passive thermochromic, their response times aren't great. So if you're looking for opportunities in that space, thermochromics would, improving response times is certainly going to expand perhaps the addressable market a little bit. And with passive photochromic, broader range of dimmability. I think dimmability is a word, and I think you spell it that way, but I'll be happy to learn at the feet of anyone who thinks it's spelled differently. There's just not that much potential. Whatever way we crunched it, it was difficult to see that those areas might expand into something, newer, passive thermochromic and passive photochromic, into something big, because they just didn't add too much to what was there before. And these are our numbers. This is just the residential markets, but I wanted to illustrate how they worked in a particular area. But the basic trends are very similar for all three of the major applications areas we look for in residential, commercial / industrial, and transportation. So basically things continue as they've been going on, but just very hard to see how these newer passive technologies continue, turn into anything that's sort of worth pursuing. There are some big surprises in this some of the time, and maybe we've got this fundamentally wrong, but there's at least another scenario that just says that there's just too many technologies in the smart Windows game altogether, and some of them are going to go altogether, and there aren't many suppliers, but at these levels of revenues, if we're right, there needn't be very many suppliers. So as a transition to talking about the active markets, the way we see this driven is, if you go back, there was this old smart Windows market where people had self-dimming windows for specialist applications, or the very high end of the market, or because it was cool. I guess literally, but I'm talking about cool as in, cool being fancy and attractive and not thermal cool. But we think primarily because of the rise in energy prices, people are now looking at the functionality in much more practical terms, perhaps doing their math better on whether this really saves them money. And this has dramatically expanded the market for smart windows as a whole. Well, okay, you want smart windows, and the business case issue is what really drives you. So you look at passive, and that gets you somewhere. But now these new active technologies are coming to fore, and it means you can do everything so much better. So we think that basically I said market evolution, but it's sort of market transition, or market dynamics might be a better word. What we're thinking here is that there will be a strong interest, growing interest in passive technologies, in particular just all window films, because it's what there is. But this will soon quite quickly transition to a growing interest in active technologies. And the active technologies, and actually there's a possibility they might be more in time, PDLC, SPD, and electrochromic, particularly electrochromic glass. And this slide, this table, gives us some idea of what these three technologies are like. And in a moment I'll turn to how we see them penetrating into the residential sector, and again, the same would be similar in the other two sectors. They're all responding to the same thing, and I think that the issue amongst consumers will become, okay, we made our decision, we're going to go to smart glass and smart windows, and we really want a lot of control, so we're going to go to an active solution. What do we have? Well, we have PDLC, and the problem with that is it gets opaque in an off state, and you don't want it necessarily to be opaque, so that narrows some of the applications. And we look at SPD, and it has a broader spectrum it's a broad spectrum of applications. I was going to use the same word. Basically, it goes from clears to tinted, which we think has more applications. And electrochromic glass is already widely used in automotive. Now, these are new-ish kinds of technologies. How do they improve over time? Well, we don't see any major breakthroughs. We do see cost reductions. And there sort of has to be cost reductions. At least we assume cost reductions in our forecasts, because right now these active technologies, as you may actually expect, are relatively expensive. We also think that there's probably a way to expand the markets for electrochromic technology, especially electrochromic glass, through tunability. The next slide really repeats some of the things that I've already talked about, and I'm not going to go through the same thing all over again, but each of these companies, each of these technologies have their own advantages, and even if we don't expect, say, wonderful things for electrochromic windows, they do have fast switching time, for instance, so that's the reason for deploying electrochromic, excuse me. We've talked about the light blockage for the different technologies already. And the interesting thing is, pretty much all of these technologies are high. The one that we find most attractive in terms of its ability to generate revenues is probably SPD, but it's really going to have to get its cost sorted out, and we think that will happen. And some of this, by the way, in terms of getting the cost structure sorted out, is really the typical chicken and an egg thing about efficiencies of scale, economies of scale. As it moves into the mainstream, there'll just be more efficiencies that get factored into the pricing of these products, and including experience curves effects. So these are our numbers, again, for the residential market. So we see SPD as already a relatively established market which continues to grow. PDLC and electrochromic glass in the residential markets are sort of there at a very modest level, but they get to be much bigger. There's a wild card that this is, in a way, the wild west of smart windows, and it's quite possible that entirely new technology will pop in there. There's a lot of interesting things going on in the Windows field using nanomaterials, and perhaps 3 or 4 years from now, there'll be some other arose on that number, but I'm not sure what they could be at the moment. So beginning to talk towards the end of this, I think there are major factors for success in the smart windows business based on what we're seeing in the marketplace, based on what vendors have told us, and based on the analysis that's in the NanoMarkets report. One of these is technology improvements. But as you've seen from our slides, the opportunity for that at the moment, the direction that they need to be clear, but the big leaps forward just don't seem ready to happen in the next 2 to 3 years. After that, everything really has to do with cost, and some of that will come from manufacturing, using advanced manufacturing technologies, new coating technologies. I'm not sure what would be most appropriate in that case, but that's the direction to look. And the usual manufacturing and distribution areas need to be looked at in order to cut down on the costs there, because although you're talking about a value-added product within the context of the glass industry, you're not really talking about huge amounts of value added. It's not like the margins on this are going to be incredible. So the usual manufacturing and distribution efficiencies would be very welcome in this market as it begins to grow. And of course, branding in just that sort of circumstance where margins are, can begin to be a little strained is also an important factor. So summing up, smart windows are driven by quite a number of factors. At this point in time, I think what's really getting the excitement, I mean, there's a lot of people on this call. We've done well with our report. There's a lot of interest in this field. I think what's driving that interest, the number one factor, is just the rise in real energy costs, even if that isn't really made explicit in the literature. That's what's driving in things in a lot of fields right now. We think there's going to be a shift from passive to active, especially as the active smart windows begin to come down in cost. And basically the argument there is, gee, we really need smart windows because we want more control for better thermal environments, better energy environments. Well, heck, if we're going to do that, why not go to the Windows technology that that gives us that control? And from the vendor side, people want to push new technologies and new products, and that's where it's going to be in the active space. I think I've already said more times than I probably should have said, there's really limited opportunities for technology breakthroughs, and some of the technologies are really niche, and maybe I should make it clear I'm talking about in the next few years. There's things hovering around in the nanomaterials community that suggest some fairly big breakthroughs that may be very important in a few years, but I don't see any breakthroughs that are just about to happen. All of this, it's about the Windows market. The Windows market is always and will be very tied to what goes on in the economy. So, that should be one of your first guides about where you think this is all headed, looking at what the construction figures are, what the economic figures are, and of course that's very local. Numbers for China are very different from the numbers for California. But this is not entirely a new technology market. It's one that's growing fast, but from a fairly established base. And we think that base at the moment is about $2.3 billion market if we include transportation, the residential and commercial/industrial market, and the technologies that we describe, I described throughout this webinar. Next slide is a bio of me, and you can read that, or you can read a bio of someone who's more interesting than me, so I'm going to flash through that. And that's our contact information, which I'll leave out long enough for you to write down where you can buy our report, which of course I would appreciate, even more than I would appreciate you reading my bio. And finally, just thank you. I can't say thank you to you individually. There's a little time for questions, I think, where Heidi will have more to say about that. And there'll be opportunity to send in questions after the webinar. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you for a very, very complete look at that market. The webinar was obviously designed to give everyone a high-level overview of the report and not be a complete dive into the details of the report. So I would encourage those of you who wish for all the detail to follow up with Lawrence and understand how to procure the report. So we've got about 9 minutes for questions. I think the number of questions reflects the strong interest in this area. If you have a question you want to add, please put it in the control panel. We'll get to as many of them as we can. So here's our first question. Do you have a number for the average price per square meter for a vendor supplying a large residential project? You note that it is the cost is too high. So in addition to what's the average price per square meter, what is the target price per square meter where you feel like it would impact the market?
There are detailed numbers. I mean, obviously to do actually one thing I should say about the report is I showed dollar numbers all the way through this. We have in the report forecasts for square meters, and then we come up with our prices and multiply them. That's how we got the numbers. We collected a lot of data on prices, and some of that is summarized in the report. I think that the takeaway from that is that everybody has a very different idea of prices. I almost put the exhibit from the report in, which shows the range of prices on the different technologies that we were quoted by different people. And we came up with ultimately what we believed from that. And we were talking to, just a whole group of people. So I don't know that I have a target price. The other thing you should remember, of course, is target prices very much depend on the construction project, because everybody has different pain factors. I can only recommend you to the report, not just because I want you to buy the report, but just because to understand the diversity. One of the reasons we collected all this pricing data was last year when we did this report. Our estimate was even more of an estimate, and we got criticized for saying by some of our customers by saying that our number was way too high for such and such. But unfortunately, we'd then be told that it was way too low for the same number. So I think that data doesn't entirely exist, and we try to do a good job. But there's no real target price other than one that you might set strategically. And I think the report would be a guide to that. But there's no perfect answer.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one. What is the expected lifetime of various product technologies, and is this a factor in product acceptance?
I'm sorry, Heidi, you faded out just at the critical word. Could you repeat that, please?
Okay. What is the expected lifetime for the various product technologies, and is this a factor in product acceptance? Lifetimes.
Actually, we didn't talk that much about lifetimes, but since you raised the question, yeah, it is. I guess the defining, well, there are two things. One of them is the window films, the classic architectural window films in buildings are often aftermarket products, retrofit markets. And then, they don't have to be long times. Obviously, you could be talking about, 3 years at a minimum, 10 years at a minimum, because people can put them in. I mean, it's like painting the building or something. When you're talking about coated glass, people expect them to last as long as windows are expected to last, which could be a very long time. If you're looking, the very first slide I put up was of all the technologies that might someday fall under, under the smart glass, smart window title, and included in there somewhere would be low E glass in a IGU, which could be very expensive items. So you want those to be in there for 10, 15, 20 years. So it sort of depends on specific applications. It sort of depends on whether it's retrofit or not. But the longer the better, I suppose, but that's pretty obvious.
Okay, thank you. Another question, how much of this is driven by energy costs versus environmental costs?
So I think that the whole thing is driven, so there's two issues here. One of them is, look, the stuff's been around in a way for quite a long time. Even some of the active technologies are nothing new. Electrochromic technologies is not something that was discovered last week. And so I think the dominant driver is the real energy cost increases, which over the past few decades have actually not been that great. Now they actually seem to be taking off and taking off. So I think that's what is the case. I think the environmental factors are secondary, and it's also important to remember that that what drives the market is not people's concern for the environment so much as regulations that are designed to make people concerned about the environment. And it really depends on a lot of things. One is how effective those regulations are. I mean, different views about how effective they should be. And that might change with the economy, because in a really down economy, people, try to make it through the day, as it were, and are less interested in environmental factors. I'm interested in the whole comfort issue. I mentioned this, so I'm just repeating myself, but this seems like that it should be a driver for people to actually buy these products, and I think it needs to be emphasized more. Back to the smart lighting project I mentioned we did. This was, the thing that's called smart lighting now is basically just highly energy efficient lighting. But what you can see is that smart lighting vendors are having a hard problem competing with each other on that, because they basically end up offering the same product. So they're now switching to looking to the comfort thing. What additional value can they add to it? And in many ways, the issues are very similar to smart windows. So maybe that's the direction smart windows ultimately goes. There's nothing about that in the report, but maybe that's for next time.
Okay. We're getting a lot of questions around the pricing issues. I know you've covered that a little bit. This question comes at it from a slightly different perspective. Yeah. How price dependent are the market projections in the report?
Well, they're very price dependent, and that's really what that's another way of saying what I said before, that when we checked in with lots of different people, we got very different prices, and sometimes, honestly, they were just wrong, because we'd get people's view of what the prices actually were rather than what they actually were. But most times, really, we got things that people have been quoted, and that's why we put square meters into the report, because you can inject your own view of prices. I mean, really, if you wanted to do a price study, it's almost like a report on its own, because there would be regional differences, especially if you were doing a worldwide study. And of course, there would be volume differences. So if I build my dream home and I want, a huge glass window with, with self-dimming glass in it, I'm going to get a different price than if someone's building some multi-story office building. It can be very different technologies. So it's very price dependent. For one of the technologies, and please don't ask me what, because I actually don't remember, the delta between the lowest price we got and the highest price was something like 80%. But there's no real way of getting to the right answer to this unless you really broke the forecast out in ways that, quite honestly, you aren't going to get it from a market research report like ours. It becomes a whole different kind of study. So there are always lots of questions about prices on everything we do, and there's just a limit to what can be done as a research within a research methodology that's acceptable at every level.
Thank you, Lawrence. Can you back up one slide to the contact information once again? I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to jot that down. And that's about all the time we have for questions today. There were quite a few more, and I know Lawrence welcomes your emails with questions as a follow-up. So, and again, we will email you the location and link to this presentation when it's available. Hopefully that'll be by tomorrow, maybe even later today. Thank you again, Lawrence. This has been a very interesting and obviously a hot topic. We want to remind you from FlexTech that to learn more about the technology behind the transparent conductor application we heard about today, I encourage you to check out the workshop at SemiCon West. That's exactly 2 weeks from today. It's in San Francisco's Moscone Center, actually in the Marriott right next door, but during the SemiCon West trade show. And we, of course, have direct links from our homepage at www.flextech.org.